In the valleys of Tabaristan lie many secrets. Mountains are the hideaways of the unwanted in society, and in Persia, the mountain ranges make many such places. The beauty of the Caspian Sea, contrasted with the danger of the steep hills of the Alborz, is a convenient, natural metaphor for the eternal fight between good and evil, which is central to the philosophy of Zoroaster and its ancient faith. In the year 867, the Iranians find themselves a colonized people. In the face of boisterous conflict between the schools of Islam which have infested the Zagros, only echoes of Ahura Mazda faintly ring out in the most remote regions of this land. Even those who continue the fight against Ahriman, like Rostam, publicly profess their faith in Allah under the boot of zealous Arabs like Hassan the missionary. Nonetheless, Rostam holds the truth in his heart, and his close friend Hormazd has taken it upon himself to keep the fight alive. Somewhere, far away, there might be a place where the Zoroastrians can be safe, but it isn't here, and so Rostam Bavandid, one of the last Sassanid rulers, gave his friend what gold he could spare and wished him luck. Hormazd was a Zoroastrian priest that maintained one of the many everlasting fires in the Dalamite Mountains. He had kept himself and his many intermarried children fed with the patronage of local people in return for his services as a mystic wise man, but recently, his sanctuary was destroyed by marauding Arabs. He was summoned to Mazandaran afterwards and set on his quest. Hormazd and his 6 children must find a home for the Mazdayazna faithful, but they'll need to first even understand the world around them. Hormazd is a curious mind and a writer. He has never left the mountain ranges he calls home, and so, for the first time, he will witness a wide world, depending on nothing more than the reports of others. He'd begin his new life by seeking to do what he had always done back home, to do good in the world and destroy evil. The world beyond Tabaristan is, especially in this era of struggle, extremely dangerous. Hormazd is looking for a place that reminds him of home but without all the danger, and he started his search traveling west to the Caucasus. He'd never seen this land before, but he'd heard of the Christians of Armenia and their successes in living out their spiritual lives there. Along the path through Armenia, though, he found himself accosted by an unending series of bandits, animals, diseases, and delays. To be fair to the world here, Hormazd is not exactly a well-traveled person. Some might call him gullible and unworldly, but he's a fast learner. The party returned to Zanjan, where there was safety, and tried traveling to Samarra instead. Perhaps where the terrain is less treacherous there would be safety, but in traveling through the Kurdish Zagros Mountains, its treacherous slopes did claim Hormazd's daughter-wife Farah. Of the 7 people that left Dalam to find a new home, already 1 has been lost within less than a year of leaving. Then, Hormazd himself fell ill, whether out of grief or from the stench of war that haunted these lands. His children worried he might not make it, but upon arriving in Samarra, the city was welcoming, and the family found an inn to rest in. In his time of sickness, Hormazd wrote, as he often did, about his travels through the Zagros. It was a beautiful place, but treacherous, and its dangers could be directly linked to the ferocity of the Kurdish people that lived there. He soon recovered after a few days in Samarra, and the family breathed a sigh of relief. Without their father, the children would surely be lost. The family had to regroup with their recovered father, and so they sat in Samarra, considering what to do next. They would need money and food to continue their trip. The only way Hormazd had ever known to acquire either of these things was either foraging or patronage, and so Hormazd told his family they would serve the Arabs and bring goodness into the world, even for those who might spit on it. They'd likely have to hide their true purpose and instead pose as simple Iranian contractors. After all, if the true purpose of their mission were to be revealed, the Arabs might not be so willing to work with them. And so the family worked for some time in Mesopotamia, writing books, erecting buildings, and conducting censuses. Whatever work they could do which was of value to whatever community would have them, they would do. And all along the way, Hormazd would, every once in a while, chit-chat with some locals about the eternal fight of good and evil. He made of many Arabs and the Mashriq Zoroastrians, even if it put them at risk. Where they hit a turning point was when Hormazd was informed of a great mountain range to the east. He was given a map by a local Bedouin merchant which pointed out the mountains of what was once called Bactria and its neighboring mountain range of the Hindu Kush. Hormazd would have to take his family across a dangerous route directly through the turmoil of Persia to reach it, but this could be just the place he needs to find. And so the family prepared for a long, arduous trip. Somehow, through what must have been divine intervention, most of the great dangers of Persia left the nomadic Dalamites alone as they reached the foot of the Tajik mountains. From some locals, Hormazd learned that these mountains were the very edge of a much larger range whose peak is called the Khan Tengr. To those willing to brave the mountains, they would find immense mountain ranges further north and east. Going north lies the Khan Tengr, and going east is Tibet, and eventually even China. Neighboring these mountains are the Hindu Kush, which are much easier to get to. The Khan Tengur, although tempting for Hormazd, felt it prudent to not try and establish his new Zoroastrian homelands in a mountain already claimed by another faith, especially one so bellicose as the Turkic shamans. Instead, he visited the city of Kabul and found it attractive but inopportune. There isn't much space here in the cold, dry mountains of Afghanistan, and this place is one of great secular value. Indians, Iranians, and Turks alike fight to control these mountains, and if he were to set up his new land here, Hormazd would likely find himself a refugee once again within just a few years. It seemed that the East was a bust, although the many peoples of this region were certainly high-paying patrons, and so they stuck around for some time before again hearing of another opportunity, a place more out of the way. Across the sea, known as the Pudig in the Zoroastrian scripture, the Oman Peninsula was dominated by local Bedouin Arabs, and had been for centuries at this point, if not millennia. The mountains to the west of Muscat would be a good choice, if not for the desolate climate and the simple fact that, well, it's not the type of place that Hormazd wants to settle in. It was pretty demoralizing for the party to find no mountains that felt right, but they wouldn't give up. Daylam is a beautiful place, but there must be a mountain somewhere with similar beauty. The party went to Basra to look for work while they planned their next adventure. Damascus was the next stop for our Zoroastrian wanderers, and they chose it because it's a huge city which might have information on greater mountain ranges to the west. Locally, there were some interesting mountains in Lebanon and in Palestine, but again, those regions are already claimed by other religions which might prove too belligerent to deal with. Instead, the city of Damascus was home to some folks of fairer complexion called Latins. They were Christian traders making a living moving goods to and from Europe, and they were all too happy to tell stories of their Venetian lagoons and Genoan hills, but one of them was from Piedmont. Piedmont literally means the toes of the mountain, the merchant explained, and he proceeded to describe the Alps to Hormazd, who was feeling that this might just be the one. The fight against evil was to be taken overseas, as Hormazd decided it was time to complete his unending search. The Alps will be the new mountain homes of the Daylamite Zoroastrians, or they won't have a new home at all. The trip was long, and the merchants that took Hormazd along with them spent plenty of time trading and talking with locals to ascertain their shifting prices of goods. This side of the world was one of stress, but also fun. The many personalities of the trading world made for good stories, but in the back of everyone's minds in the market was always the true priority: profit. Every story told was a tactic, and every friendship made more of a business move. As Hormazd became a bit closer with the merchants he was traveling with, they started commenting on how his sons all took wives that looked just like them. The Venetian merchants laughed, saying, "Wow, I can hardly tell which of your children are in-laws," which Hormazd laughed at as well, remembering it's not very acceptable here to practice familial marriage. Either way, their travels brought them to Rome in October of 893, where the merchants said they'd be making some prayers for their next trip and then returning to their respective home cities. Hormazd wished them well and asked for the direction of the Alps. The merchants recommended visiting Pavia, the court of the Carolingian king of Italy, a mere boy. The Milanese merchant mentioned that trading in Pavia has been easier lately, as the underage king has been easily influenced by simple things. "He's a little slow," the merchant added. It was perfect. Hormazd by this point is a pretty old man, but with what strength he has left, he will create a new home for his children, many of whom he is outliving by this point. Not everyone is cut out for a harsh life of traveling, but thankfully, there are grandkids to raise in their places. Shortly after arriving in Milan, Hormazd did some work and earned a name for himself locally before being summoned by Archimbald, the 9-year-old king.
"Hello there, Eastern man! I am the king of, my kingdom..."
"Italy," shouted the regent, berating the boy for his incompetence.
"Yes, Italy! Welcome! So, what's your story?"
"My king, I have traveled far from a land called Daylam to escape the persecution of the conquering Arabs. My name is Hormazd, and I come with my sons and their wives. We are a simple and wise people who have, wherever we have gone, only ever spread goodness and happiness. We treat those around us with respect and seek only to destroy evil. My children and I have crossed deserts, seas, and war zones to find a place of peace where we can perform our acts of goodness without fear of our lives, and thus have found ourselves here." After consulting a map, the regent whispered to his king details about the politics of Iran, and a guess that Hormazd and his group are indeed pagan fire worshippers.
"So you fight evil and create good? That sounds pretty good to me."
"My liege, these are pagans that make mockery of our Catholic faith. We'd be best off making them one with their supposedly holy fires, or at least exiling them. If I may, my king."
"Tarkus is my favorite YouTuber." Oh, wait, that's not in the lines. Oop. Just cut that out, Tarkus. Go ahead.
"It's only natural to fear what you do not know. I would not encourage you to listen to your regent in this situation, although his wisdom is something to be acknowledged in other matters, I'm sure. My king, if you would allow it, I'd like to prove to you my usefulness, and I believe your wisdom, which is inherent to a great king like yourself, will help you decide how I can be useful. If you cannot find a place for me or my children here, then take your regent's counsel and put us to the fires." There was a moment of pause, where his regent first seemed to expect that Archibald would indeed kick out these pagans, but then the king looked at his regent. He's always been overbearing and bothersome. He's always been mean and rude and never spoke to him with respect. This Eastern man, though, he is strange and different. He has respect for the throne.
Hormuzio, Hormuz, whatever your name is, I think you are finally a subject that knows how to show respect and reverence for his king. I'm tired of you, Regent. You're not nice to me, and I demand that my court treat me well.
Before the regent could interrupt, Archibald hushed him with a finger.
From today, I choose you, Hormuzio, to be my new regent and advisor on religious affairs, and my old regent, I say he should be united with the fires that he worships.
My liege, I don't worship fires, they do.
The king has spoken. Hormuzio, I'd like you to dispose of this traitor. Oh, and then I'd like to meet you in my chambers to discuss more of your trip from the east.
And so the regent was dragged to the dungeon, burned at the stake, while Hormazd had been elevated to an important position within the Italian court. Now he need only consolidate his power and eventually gain control of it, which wouldn't be too hard with a king like this. Hormazd now has influence in the Italian court, and although he presented himself with good intentions, he does have some more nefarious ideas going through his head. He's at a crossroads here. He can try and live as a vassal of the king here, and perhaps buy some land in the mountains and make some kind of long-standing deal with the king, but the risk of future kings reneging on the deal made that a poor idea. Instead, Hormazd met with Archibald a few days after replacing the old regent and discussed with him the limitations that the Pope had put on him, and that the purpose of God is to spread goodness. The Catholic Church has spread war and distress, haven't they? These arguments, from the eloquent and wise Hormazd, worked on the relatively weak-willed Archibald. The boy formally converted to Mazdaisna Zoroastrianism from that point, and plunged the Kingdom of Italy into madness. Archibald's conversion was understood by the realm to be a machination of his new best bud, Hormazd, which was correct, but what was coming next would certainly surprise them. Hormazd began recruiting men from across Italy, mostly sellswords or rogues, but anyone who would be willing to fight. The plan here is to ask Archibald for a sponsorship to expand the kingdom into an appropriate location, such as, for example, Spoleto. There are mountains there, which is good, but over the coming years of building up power, the realities of the Pope's immense power, thanks to his tithes, made this option unviable. The other mountains of this place are northwards, but Archibald rules those lands. He could buy them off the king, but that's too little land to thrive in. Instead, despite the king's openness to his people, Hormazd decided he'd have to get enough power to secure his future. If he were to buy land here, there's no telling what the next king might think of this little Iranian enclave, and then the one after that, and so on. It was drastic, but perhaps using his connections with the king, Hormazd could convince him to give away more and more power until eventually he'd be the new king. The plot to seize the realm began with several important figures that had a strong dislike for the Carolingians joining in. It turns out that although Hormazd had a very long-term plan in mind, the boy was quite willing to trust his confidant, and so, within less than a year of planning, Hormazd asked the boy if he would accompany him to the dungeon, for another lesson on the nature of good and evil or whatever. Then, Archibald was pushed into prison, and Hormazd said that he'd be running the kingdom for the time being, since Archibald had been kidnapped. He'll return when funds for the ransom come. At this point though, even Archibald was aware that he'd been duped, and that no ransom was coming. Hormazd is the new king of Italy, or rather, the Hafizid clan as it is now known. At the age of 81, Hormazd has finally achieved the goal that he began his entire adventure to do, but there was a future to secure for his people. The entirety of this land is Christian, and many of them are inherently hostile to their new Zoroastrian overlords. Some of the locals did convert when Hormazd took power, which was helpful for sure. He was a respected figure despite his heathen status, and in order to foster friendly relations, Hormazd did not immediately start revoking titles from his Christian vassals, as one might expect. Instead, he declared war on Verona to try and gain more royal domain and project power. The Kingdom of Italy is fractured, and uniting it might further the respect his subjects will have of him. After Verona's conquest, he also started a legend detailing accounts from him and his children about their travels across Iran and Arabia. Without much need for embellishment, the story was already quite good, but certainly some exaggeration will help the people feel like converting. It'll take a long time though for that legend to spread around, and it'll likely go beyond Hormazd's life. Of course, despite all this work, Hormazd eventually had to face the reality of his rebellious subjects and their not-so-secret works to overthrow him. A peasant rebellion, aided by many noble lords, rose up at the turn of the century, and in the Battle of Gallarate, the Hafezid forces were defeated. The army made an attempt to stop the peasants at Milan, but they were intent on storming the city and deposing the king. Instead, though, Hormazd promised his rebellious Christian subjects their own land and independence, and with that, Italy was fractured further under the weight of its turmoil. The peasants founded a new land on the coast called Genoa, while a handful of lords from Como, Treviso, and Tuscany gained complete independence. There's no reason to give up here, though. Hormazd has faced many setbacks in his life, and this one is no different. The mission to restore Italy's borders were still on. In particular, the Kingdom of Burgundy held several fiefdoms where it shouldn't, and so Hormazd began his campaign to defeat the Carolingians once again, but during the war, his age caught up with him. Hormazd had been an infirm old man for a long time by now, but somehow his spirit felt young. No matter how young he might have felt, his physical body could not avoid its failing systems, and so he passed away in the year 903, leaving his realm in a tricky place. Most of Hormazd's children didn't live nearly as long as he did, and so his land was divided among his many grandchildren. Shah Hormazd II is a 30-year-old man with a strange story. He's found himself, in his early years while wandering in the camp, taking to a lot of alcohol and friendly sparring. He's an honest and kind person, making him, in his grandfather's eyes, an extremely virtuous person, but as a ruler he's a very strange combination of traits and aptitudes. By pure personality, Hormazd II is honest, compassionate, and indecisive, which might possibly constitute the worst combination a king could have, but he's also a drunken blade master. If you somehow provoke anger in the Shah, he could literally slay you on the spot and give you a bewailing burial at the same time. Some say his fickleness was a result of his drinking, and others say he drank to help him be more decisive, but no one really knows for sure. Either way, Hormazd II has a lot of work ahead of him. First of all, he has no money because his lands have been split up among his uncles, and that will certainly harm his efforts to continue his grandfather's efforts. Nonetheless, he did win the Burgundian War by strategically keeping his armies lowered when the enemy wasn't around. He was able to take over Parma and Tortona for himself to replace the land he lost to his uncles. With that conquest, the peasants rose up again, seeking to try and secure freedom, how the Genoese did, but this time Hormazd II was able to quickly capture their leader and force the peasants down, along with their supporting lords. For their rebellion, Hormazd II revoked many Christian titles, and he began a policy of migration from the homelands in Daylam. You see, the whole point of this entire trip had been, originally, to find a new home for the Zoroastrians, and if the local population is going to be so hostile, then it would be better to just replace them, most likely. Word of a new home, friendly to the ancient Iranian ways, spread east, and soon Lombardy was flooded with refugees, many of whom barely made it through the dangerous trip. With the arrival of some new immigrants, Hormazd II felt emboldened to attack the very head of Christendom, the Pope. He declared war for the remaining land around the Po River that had not yet been reclaimed. The Pope was a much more powerful man, both secularly and theocratically, than Hormazd, but he's currently caught up in a rebellion with his Romanian lords, and the hope is to sneak in and annex the Po Valley before he can respond. Parma and Cremona were quickly occupied, and then Hormazd simply lowered his army, hoping that he could save what little money he had by doing so. Every once in a while, the Pope would send some small band of mercenaries to reclaim the valley, perhaps believing that Hormazd II had a much smaller army than in reality. Each mercenary company that came was entirely wiped out, giving them an inability to report back to their contractor. Perhaps the Pope believed that the mercenaries were just doing their job and didn't have anything else to say. Regardless, the Po Valley was annexed into Italy in January of 912, and with it came a pretty well-unified Italy. It's not complete yet, but at least it isn't so fractured anymore. Further, Dalamite settlers arrived in Florence soon after, creating two Iranian enclaves in the major cities of Italy. With time, these settlers might spread out and eventually call Italy their native home. Hormazd continued his Italian unification campaign and conquered Modena alongside some Venetian land, and now all that remained was Genoa and its offshoot in Tuscany. The newborn Duchy of Genoa had actually been at war with Burgundy when Hormazd invaded, and the main Genoese army was retreating from a recently lost battle. They were intercepted by Hormazd, and as a result, the peasant duke was captured. A deal was struck that added Genoa to the Kingdom of Italy, but allowed the lord there to keep ruling from what little land he had left over in Tuscany. Once the truce is up, the rest will be reclaimed, but for now, Italy is unified in all but one county. The Alps are secure, and Hormazd II has expanded the royal domain immensely, securing both wealth and power for him and his lineage. He even personally held Como, which in good time might soon become the location for an ever-burning fire to exalt Ormazd and act as a beacon for all lost Zoroastrians. Many of the Italian lords that had not rebelled have slowly converted to Mazdiasna Zoroastrianism, and in so doing have secured their futures in the realm to some extent. A royal fire was kindled in July of 920, which would commemorate Hormazd II's successful continuation of his father's legacy, and was lit at the same time as the fire in Como to symbolize the Shah's dedication to his mission. Thus would begin a period of peace, development, and settlement in Italy. By 923, the Dalamite settlers expanded their influence from Milan down to the edges of the Genoese mountains, as settlers traveled to and from Florence and chose to sometimes sit down in the middle. Hormazd II had a proper Iranian crown forged by a Turkic blacksmith, Koza, who had accompanied the most recent wave of migrants, which he dubbed Sher-e-Latana, the Lion of Latium. From here, the Christian world had seen many great setbacks, as it turns out stories of the Zoroastrian migrations to Italy had emboldened others to invade Christendom too. Just to the north of Como, the warrior queen Freydis of Denmark had invaded the entirety of Germany, and in fact secured a land border with Italy through the narrow Alps passage of Como. Off in Britain, a Viking lord had also conquered the entire empire and united it, but the descendants of Ivar the Boneless adopted Irish Christianity, which was still subservient to the Pope at least. While conducting a minor invasion into Corsica to expand the realm a little bit, Hormazd II started noticing that he was having some trouble understanding the new Dalamite migrants. They both still spoke the same language very clearly, but just a couple words here and there felt unfamiliar. It didn't help that after living among Latins for so long, it was quite normal to integrate some Latinisms into his speech, but essentially the distance that the Western Dalamites had put between themselves and their home has led to a divergence of culture. Naturally, a king has little influence on the exact nature of a cultural revolution like this, but all he could do was accept it, and so the new Neo-Italian culture was founded. Lame name, I know, but the event generates a name and I can't change it. Let's instead refer to this Neo-Italian culture as something a bit more flavorful, like Garbi, meaning Western in Persian. It's a simple name, but what else could describe them best? This new culture maintained the rugged mountaineering of its home culture, but added in a stronger emphasis on farming and temple building, which I have to say is quite appropriate given recent events. Sometimes, the random divergent cultural event gives you something pretty appropriate. With age, though, has come a sense of renewed purpose. It's unfortunate that all the beautiful holy sites of Zoroastrianism are off in the east, and Hormazd is almost 60. Before he dies, he'd like to go back east and see some of the places that inspired the entire journey to the west. He was born in the camp with his grandfather and never got to see the beauty they had abandoned. As a Shah now, he'd likely be able to reach the holy site unscathed, as no warmongering heathens would be willing to try and strike down a Shah, would they? He arrived in Urmia after a long trip across the seas and a march through Syria and the Armenian mountains. The beauty of the place was enhanced by the coincidence that Hormazd II had run out of beer on the way over. He was anxious without a hard drink, but his sight improved and his fogginess went away for the first time in a very long time. He vowed to give up alcohol for the rest of what remained of his life after seeing the great temples of Urmia, so beautifully laid into the mountains there. He made it home safely, a changed man, and was greeted with the demands of a pretender to claim his throne. His uncle, now quite the elder, Kegobad, ruling from Trent, had mustered support in the Shah's absence, and was now pushing to become the new Shah. The war was poorly thought out, as it entirely depended on Hormazd simply not making it back home, but once the war was over, the Shah showed mercy. Had the trip lasted just a little bit longer, the plan may have worked out, as Hormazd II did indeed pass away shortly into the rebellion. The Shah, which had so effectively secured this new realm, lived only to be 60, but left in charge his firstborn son Zia, a diplomatic Shah with greater ambitions than his forefathers. In the most ancient Persian chronicles, going back thousands of years, there is one continuous theme. Every ruler traces their line back to some kind of founder. The Achaemenids draw their line to Achaemenes, the Sassanids to Sasan, and the Arsacids to Arsaces, and so on. This is of course just a naming convention, but each of these names, though simply a name at their inception, have come to encapsulate the very essence of their respective dynasties. What could a Ziyadid dynasty potentially be like? These were the questions on the mind of Zia, the now great-grandson of Hormazd I, who bore the legacy of a revered man. Zia is a lot like his father in a way. He's also kind-hearted, but much more ambitious and willful. Zia fought on the field for his father as a royal knight and had observed the nature of war. It's a cruel thing, but a necessary thing in this society. Zia is lucky to be a strong, well-fed, and armor-clad warrior compared to the poor souls under him that would be mowed down by the princes on the other side of the field. There's something about that which you would think would motivate Zia to stop war and be a pacifist, but it would, through a series of logical leaps, encourage Zia to conduct warfare on an unprecedented level compared to his predecessors. War will happen while the possibility of victory exists. No lord would throw their time, money, and men away on a war they have no hope to win, so for that reason, to stop war, Zia must become the most powerful king of the West. He must become a king of kings, a Shahanshah. After putting down the pretenders that challenged his father, Zia started a grand tour to begin gauging the support for an all-out war that his vassals might have. He can't do this alone, and he'll need to know who's on his side and who is not. He would feast with and walk with his vassals, discussing their thoughts on the realm. Some of them were Italian and some were Iranian, but all of them were relatively open to Zia. There was respect for his eloquence and dignity. Zia's reign was something many lords were looking forward to, as he gave off the aura of a warrior poet king. Many lords knew him from the previous wars he'd fought as a knight in under his father, and this was a heartening outcome to the tour. Nonetheless, words could sometimes betray reality, so as something of a test, Zia declared war on Sardinia to complete the conquest of the islands that his father had begun conquering. Let's see if the vassals will truly fall in line to help conquer new lands. Naturally, Zia received a declaration of war soon after, and he was fully expecting it to be a vassal demanding some pretender be elevated, but it wasn't. It was some German lord trying to conquer Friuli. That's quite the provocation, and quite the opportunism. Zia wasn't particularly angry about it, but he instead saw it as an opportunity. The Kingdom of Bavaria, north of the Alps, was a large and prosperous land. There were great farmlands there and beautiful rolling hills. Perhaps this relatively minor provocation from a rogue lord in Istria could be justification to invade. The stars aligned in the spring of 948, with Zia announcing that Christian aggression threatened their very existence. If the Garbi will not fight, then they will be conquered. And so, Zia's great ambitions would begin. He invaded Bavaria, moving up through the Alps, which by now were very familiar territory for him, and marched north to Innsbruck. Once the capital city fell, the Bavarian king was brought low and forced to take himself and all his lords and leave this land for good. Bavaria and all its farms would be appropriated for new refugee land parcels to be distributed to arriving peasants from the east. The land itself was to be governed by whatever cousins, nephews, and other kinsmen Zia had, as he believed he would be best off trusting land with his family. He gave directives to each vassal to encourage the growth of Garbi communities, and in good time, he would make of this Christian land a home for his people. Zia next invaded Venice to take control of its lucrative trade nodes, and then he was faced with a massive peasant rebellion across Bavaria. It's only natural that the locals would not be happy with their new management, but their deaths would only make it easier for Iranian settlers to take hold. The peasants fought fiercely. At first, it looked almost like Zia might be humiliated by some upstarts, but he managed to take control of the situation and defeat the peasants decisively in Erding. These victories emboldened the foolhardy Zia, who decided that Rome would be his next conquest. But he was quickly reminded of the nascent nature of his imperial ambitions. The Pope and his unending coffers hired the best mercenary warriors in the land and annihilated Zia's forces, capturing the Shah right there. In another world, the Pope may have taken his head right there for daring to challenge the Curia, but instead Zia, in a moment of legendary strength, broke his iron shackles apart and escaped his cell to return to Milan. The imagery of their Shah, sitting on his throne with blood-stained clothes and disconnected shackles on his wrists, would prove motivating for his people, who were ready to try again and defeat the Pope. It was unfortunate then that, despite the new motivation, the many professional papal soldiers inflicted upon Zia another defeat outside of Florence, and with that, he was forced to surrender a reparation for the cost of the mercenaries. The sum would put this new empire into both shame and debt. While Zia himself was not so easily demotivated, some of his vassals felt that perhaps he was not the legendary conqueror they ought to have put their weight behind. In time, Zia paid off his debts and reassembled his army to invade south of the Pope. If he can't fight through the Papal States, he'll fight around them. He landed in Salerno, establishing an enclave of influence that would expand to encompass the neighboring land, but for now, Zia declared himself the ruler of a new empire. He had failed to take Rome, but that did not necessarily ruin his reputation enough to take away the opportunity to become the Shahanshah he dreamed of. The Empire of Italia, its current name, was about half and half Garbi Iranian and Latin-speaking Italian. The policy of land appropriation and migratory encouragement was working, and through that success would Zia be remembered alongside his Bavarian conquests. Now that there are plenty of Iranians in Italy, Zia was able to use their knowledge of combat from the rugged mountains and plateaus of Iran to recruit an elite regiment of Asawira, in a sort of echo of the Persian empires of old. They would first be used to conquer the island of Sicily, which is very rich and centrally positioned in the Mediterranean. Through Sicily, refugees could rest and then board other boats to get to Florence or Venice and then make their way up to Bavaria, where, so far, many had settled. Bavaria is about a fifth Iranian as of 965, but there's more work to be done there. The following years after the conquest of Sicily saw Zia reaching an old enough age that he could no longer keep up with the youth as he had before. He's still an ambitious conqueror, but he's done all he can in his time. That being said, he has one last contribution to secure his name in the Iranian chronicles. The Empire of Italia needs government which will last beyond his years. Just before the new year, in 967, Zia completely restructured the realm to better resemble the bureaucracy of an ancient Persian empire, but adapted to the realities of the modern day. The Hafizid clan and its subclans were converted to an imperial system of governance where each duchy was ruled in the stead of the Shahanshah instead of being nominally personal domains. The realm was given a more appropriate name as well, being known broadly as New Persia, and this era being the era of the Ziyadid dynasty locally. The dynasty was still called Hafizid, but Zia became the more important figure in the family than whoever Hafiz, presumably some ancestor of Hormuzd I, was. In response, the Germans declared war to take Swabia to try and stop the rising empire. Naturally, the Germans would be defeated by Zia, who was able to raise immense armies thanks to the new administrative system. After reorganizing the empire and sorting out some of his stubborn clansmen of Bavaria, Zia died at the age of 77 in 973. He ruled for 44 years and achieved the most so far of any of his ancestors. In his place came his son and cousin, Hormazd, named after the previous rulers, and in Hormazd did the realm begin to see some of the consequences of the familial marriage that so well defined the Hafizid dynasty. Hormazd III was covered in unsightly scales which had their benefits in a way, but certainly gave an almost alien look to the new Shahanshah. That being said, Hormazd III is a very competent ruler, if only he weren't so old already. New Persia finds itself in an interesting position here. With the question of papal sovereignty still hanging in the balance, the answer has so far been to simply go around them after the previous attempts to take it went so poorly. Where previous kings and emperors have failed to take Rome, Hormazd III plans to make it the conquest for which he'll be remembered. Of course, he's not as foolish as his ancestors. He won't just jump onto Rome and try to beat them head to head. No, he'll spend time preparing for an overwhelming assault and defeat the Pope in humiliating fashion. In fact, he won't just take Rome. Hormazd III intends to end the papacy as a concept. Before getting too much into that though, I just want to mention that I've managed to convert a very large swath of land to my culture, and that is entirely thanks to the vassal directive system. Every time I make a vassal, I tell them to convert counties, and it has worked very effectively. As you can see in 976 here, most of my country is Neo-Italian, or Garbi as we're referring to them for the story of the video. Just wanted to point out how amazing this small mechanic is for making the game more fun and interesting mechanically and roleplay wise. Back to the story. Hormazd III saw his opportunity to take Rome after a few years of waiting around, as he heard news of another rebellion from the lords of Romagna against the Pope's authority. The Pope is as powerful as ever, but with his attention split, maybe the new Persian armies can overrun Rome before the Pope can respond. The armies quickly took Viterbo while the Pope was off in Ancona, and then the Great Siege against Rome began. It would be a long one, with the fortified Aurelian walls providing a staunch defense. Indeed, the siege would prove too difficult as the army backed off to Viterbo when scouts reported that a papal army was moving south. By positioning in the occupied forts of Viterbo, Hormazd's army was able to get an edge over the papal mercenaries who attacked with reckless abandon, believing themselves to be invincible. That was their mistake, as the Persian Asawira ran circles around their heavily armored opponents. Claiming a victory against the hordes of papal mercenaries was already an amazing accomplishment after the failures of the previous shahs, but only victory would suffice for Hormazd III. After backing away from Rome, Hormazd was hoping to bait his enemies into attempting to reclaim Viterbo so he could catch them out again on the open field, and to ensure his victory, he even hired some mercenaries of his own. This strategy worked even better than expected, as the papal forces split into two pieces to siege two fortresses. Divided, these Christians will be conquered. The entire papal force was wiped from this earth, although the Pope was of course not captured since he was not on the field. He was a coward, leading from Rome by messenger pigeon. If he would not leave his castle, then he will be dragged from it in shame, and so Rome fell in November of 979 and was sacked. The Pope was ripped from his throne and forced to give up the Eternal City to its new stewards, the Garbi. The Pope expected to only lose Rome in this war, but at the last moment, Hormazd mentioned that he made a typo on his war declaration. He had written Rome, but meant to write Romagna, and there was nothing the Pope could do to stop him. In one fell swoop, nearly the entire papal state was annexed, being left to rule what little land it had in Capua. The land of Romagna was handed out to more of Hormazd's family, and while some suggested that Rome would make for a better capital than Milan, the Hafsid family had grown to like Milan by this point and chose to stay there. The momentum of this campaign carried through into further conquest in southern Italy, where Ibadi Muslims had come to dominate, and in response, the Pope called for a crusade to retake Burgundy. Why he chose Burgundy is beyond me when Rome was in peril, but a crusade it shall be all the same. The Crusaders came in October of 981, but the apparently attacking Crusaders didn't quite understand what attacking meant, since they were immediately put on the back foot once Hormazd marched on Capua. Unfortunately, he can't just occupy the papal capital and end the war. He will have to actually fight off the Christians in Burgundy, and so he turned northwest, where after just 2 battles, the Crusaders surrendered. It was a real Hail Mary to go for Burgundy like this, but the spirit of an army faced with overwhelming odds is easy to dismantle. The Crusaders went home to lick their wounds when Hormazd completed his conquest of the entire Italian peninsula. It was just a matter of waiting on truces, since Hormazd had no reason to break any diplomatic treaties to get his work done. Why rush? Sure, he's kind of old, but he's not that old, is he? The final conquest in Italy was the War for Apulia, which ended within just a few weeks, and then Hormazd III met with the Pope, who was squatting in Rome, hoping to gather peasants to try and overthrow their Zoroastrian overlords. By now, his once beautiful papal tiara was covered in dirt, and Hormazd spoke with the Pope, Hadrianus. He simply unfurled a map, showing the newest borders, and explained to the Pope that he can either be killed right now, or formally recognize that on this map, there is no such thing as the papacy. Broken down to tears, the 90-year-old Pope accepted that the era of a unified Catholic Church was over, at least for now. Peace took the empire for a few more years after this, at which point Hormazd III left his mark successfully on the lineage of Imperial New Persia. He ruled for only 19 years, which is the shortest length of any emperor yet, but he accomplished a significant achievement and secured the future of the empire against Christianity, presumably for good. In his place came his brother, Mirmardan, the city builder, who has his own interesting story. Mirmardan was appointed the governor of Venice before becoming emperor, and he ruled over his territory with the full intention to simply create a prosperous land. He intended to carry that intention over to his time as an emperor. He was, in many ways, chosen for the throne because of that gentle touch. He's content, but shy and deceitful, meaning most of the vassals don't see much of him, and what they do see is hard to decipher. From this point, the empire would enter a sort of healthy stagnation. The borders aren't changing much, but the world certainly is. In the east, a great conqueror, Sukto, a Scythian, yeah, that's his culture, has united Mongolia and brought down their wrath to the old country. To be clear, this is not Genghis Khan, this is just a Scourge of God conqueror that happens to be from Mongolia. In Central Africa, the Kanem-Bornu Kushites are beginning to work their way up the Nile into Egypt, potentially erupting into North Africa to face the small enclaves of New Persian control there, and across the seas, the descendants of Ivar the Boneless continue to rule Britain as almost a bastion of safe Christendom, albeit of a different nature. The Byzantine Empire, in all its glory, is ruled by the peasant David, an Almohadi Muslim Greek, which is definitely something. So far, this has turned into quite the campaign, but the story's not quite over. Every empire has its peak, and then its fall, but in between that period is always the plateau of prosperity where the fruits of the struggle are finally born. Mirmardan is the overseer of the Great Stagnation, and in his rule, most of his time would be spent on the internal gubernatorial politics of the empire. For his unwillingness to go to war, the warhawks of the realm swore off their support, and the conquering reputation of the descendants of Zia formally ended with Mirmardan. In an effort to rehabilitate his image, the Shahanshah did invade Bohemia at least, but it just wasn't very much of a conquest. Instead, Mirmardan enjoyed several hunts, taking advantage of the vast woodlands of the Bavarian Alps. He even attempted to hunt a legendary white bear, but failed to take it down each time he faced it. In the year 1000, the Shahanshah went down to Rome to go to university, and this should give you an idea of what our content emperor does with his time. He has made the good choice, though, of assigning several vassals to be naval or frontier governorships, which means even as Mirmardan spends his time mostly doing nothing of value, his governors have gotten on to expanding the empire anyway. In particular, the governors have made progress into Illyria and North Africa. Mirmardan did complete one meaningful war, which was the conquest of Burgundy. He did so simply because having full control over the mountain passes of the Alps would keep his realm safe, as well as being another opportunity to earn the good graces of his vassals. But the war was a simple affair. Burgundy had been neutered long ago when its richest counties were taken by various governors of the empire in several wars over the years. The immense wealth of the empire was being funneled into Myrmidon's pockets, and he mostly spent it on building up his personal domain when he wasn't spending it on feasts, hunts, and universities. All this spending and magnificence did help bring over more refugees from Iran after the Mongols reached further west, and so we see that by 1013, pretty much all of Bavaria and Italy are entirely Iranian, and it's even spreading a bit into Croatia and France. In 1017, the Kingdom of Sicily was formally integrated into New Persia as a sort of insult to the now collapsing Byzantines. It was a bit strange that the Romans made claim to Magna Graecia by this point, and by formally integrating the kingdom into New Persia, Myrmidon was, in a way, emulating the old Greek-Persian rivalry, which he was happy to do. About a year later, while on a hunting trip, Myrmidon had his 67th birthday and was already looking like he might soon pass away. Each emperor has been in their 40s upon taking the throne, which has created quite the revolving door of emperors, and indeed, in 1021, Myrmidon passed away from old age, leaving his throne to another old man, Kirkir. However, we will not be pursuing Kirkir's story, as the stagnation of an empire is best observed from a different perspective. While New Persia enjoys its prosperity, there are always those on the lower rungs of society who see prosperity as a choking grasp on their ambition. It's time for a new destiny, and so I let RNGesus decide where the story shall go. We have ended up in the frontier governorate of Steiermark under Kegobad from the Yeseman house. The empire is, at this point, still in a period of stagnation, but Governor Kegobad presents a more interesting perspective. He's not a particularly ambitious man as well, but he's arrogant, and to be quite frank, this little governorate of Steiermark just isn't all that impressive. For now, he'll build up the forts here to gain some experience as a governor, but eventually, Kegobad would like to migrate to a more prestigious governorate. In particular, he has his eyes on Bohemia, which is a very rich region and one where he could operate with more power. In 1034, the first major civil war of the realm broke out. This was the result of Myrmidon's death and replacement with the tyrannical zealot Mandahar, who tried to crack down on Christians in the empire. It's not necessarily the case that all these governors like the Christians enough to take up arms against him, but rather that it's an excuse to do so, in fears that the Shahanshah might come after them next. Kegobad was hoping to sit this conflict out and just keep being an effective governor. His content nature means he's not exactly snapping at opportunities, but instead playing the long game. It's an interesting strategy considering how old he is, but I guess the mid-50s aren't so bad, right? After about 8 more years of righteous governorship, Kegobad stepped down from Steiermark to begin his plotting. He's already 60 and ailing, but the competition for control over Bohemia is low. Kegobad used his connections to get himself in first place for it. Now it's just a matter of forcing the current governor to step down, and with that, Kegobad is back. Now to build up Bohemia, and come to the unfortunate realization that it is very unlikely that our governor here will live much longer. He's been far too slow with his ambitions, and he doesn't even particularly know what his ambitions were. He just knew he wanted something more than Steiermark. He sort of accepted that whatever plans he had were to become secondary to the importance of giving his son, Kabus, a chance to do what he wants with his life. The boy came of age in 1051, and Kegobad taught him all he knew of governance. Then he entered retirement, as Kegobad stepped down from Bohemia and got his own son elected to the throne. The idea behind this is to get that little boost of gold before dying, since it's pretty much free money, by the way. Shortly after, he passed away, and so the relatively uneventful life of Kegobad has ended, to make way for the young, and actually ambitious, Kabus of Bohemia. Kabus is a different figure from those we've covered so far. The origin of this entire empire was the creation of a new homeland for the Zoroastrian faithful, but the purpose of New Persia has become one of imperial ascendancy by this point. Kabus doesn't really care much for all the religiosity of the realm or for its purpose beyond what he can get out of it. Kabus has the makings of an emperor in him, but not a leader for the Zoroastrian people, which the Shahanshah has indirectly become. Nonetheless, he'll pursue greatness, and his first step in that process is to turn Bohemia into his own fiefdom. The plan is to subsume Moravia into the Duchy of Bohemia and then demand control over the proper kingdom of Bohemia to become sort of a private estate for his plans. It'll take a very long time to make this little plan happen, but as long as Kabus can stay in the shadows, he'll be able to get away with it eventually. While that plot cooks, Kabus is going to need friends and allies across the empire to help him in his imperial bid, so he's been hosting feasts and generally spending time with the important cogs of the imperial machine. Unfortunately, the old policy of the first emperors to appoint their family to pretty much every gubernatorial seat has resulted in quite the concentration of power in just one offshoot cadet branch, the Ajaccio family, named for their origins in Corsica, hold the vast majority of the land in Bavaria, and as such, members of their family are almost guaranteed to win the empire. Given enough time, either the Ajaccio family will itself fracture in its own size, or Qaboos will find an alternative way to the throne. In February of 1068, the Shahanshah Amin passed away, leaving the empire to his fellow kinsman Hormuz, which might present an opportunity. New emperors are always unpopular at first until they've placated the rebellious elements of the realm, but Qaboos is still working on subsuing Moravia. The opportunity might have to pass him by. It took over a decade, but in 1070, Qaboos finally took over Moravia surreptitiously, with the idea that the governor of Moravia agreed to unite the two governorships to better fight off the Sorbs, who were invading at the time of the unification. Of course, Qaboos had no intention of using his own men to fight off these invaders. That was the Shahanshah's job. If we're being honest, he wouldn't be able to fight them off anyway. The emperor did push back the Sorbs and accept the unification of Moravia and Bohemia, but then Qaboos caught the measles, and there was fear that he might not survive it. His children especially were under threat, however our brave governor did survive. We now find ourselves at an impasse, at least with regards to Qaboos' imperial ambitions. He doesn't want to end up like his father, sitting on his plots for so long that they never come to fruition, but the current empire is just so damn stable. There's no opportunity in prosperity. Qaboos will have to make an opportunity if one won't come, and then, as if the universe knew of his ambitions, the emperor passed away once again. The new Shahanshah, Esfandiar, is much less popular than the old one, and so deposing him might just be possible. First, Qaboos assembled an army of elite Iranian cavalry to train and drill in secret in Prague. He then borrowed some imperial armies using his influence from the feasts he attended with the other families, and initiated a campaign to conquer Sorbia. The plan here is to demonstrate a greater level of competence than the current emperor and lead the empire in a way. If news of the Slavic frontier that Qaboos was conquering could spread further than the news of Esfandiar's reign, then he might have a chance at winning the throne. The Sorbs were defeated with relative ease, but that was just the start. In 1083, Qaboos declared a war to take the entirety of the prestigious kingdom of Poland. The Poles were a relatively large and successful kingdom, and by taking them down, Qaboos would certainly prove his worth. The Poles, ever confident, marched into the forests of Moravia ready to take the fight to their attackers, and Qaboos obliged them with an ambush outside of Opava. It wasn't a decisive win by any means, but it was a win when the Polish army routed and returned to their homes. And after handing the Poles another defeat in Hradec, he made good on that threat. The walls of Krakow were poorly kept, as the Poles hadn't expected a siege, and so Qaboos won the war. He didn't immediately end it though, as he wanted to win over more support back home by showing the Poles yet more defeats. In a battle in the Krakowian countryside, Siemowit of Poland was captured and brought to Milan in a parade to spread the greatness of Qaboos' military successes. This had the desired effect, and afterwards he ended the war with a massive increase in territory for the governorship of Bohemia. Unfortunately, such a massive swath of land is far too much for a mere governorship to manage, and it looked like the Shahanshah was onto Qaboos' plans and refused to grant him a kingdom. Rather than watch his work deteriorate to poor management, Qaboos willingly gave up the new land to his liege. What he didn't expect was the goodwill he'd get for that. It seems like the other governors, and even the emperor himself, were quite pleased to see this sort of realm-oriented thinking going on. Credit for the conquest of Poland was given to Qaboos, and his fame increased more. The next decade or so would see Qaboos laying the little foundations he'd need to seize power. He needs to depose the emperor, but he doesn't quite have the support to do so yet. Instead, he'd spend the next decade fighting off Slavic peasants and settling the region with more Iranians to solidify his control. That was until the flashpoint finally came to be in 1091. Some dissatisfied Mazdaistan Zoroastrians looked to old texts and old interpretations to come to a closer understanding of the reality of the divine nature of good and evil. Well, none of that is particularly important to Qaboos, but if this heretic movement of Behafarides can be strong enough, then perhaps he can try and become the leader of it and take power that way. There's only one way to find out, and so Qaboos formally denied the holiness of the eternal flames of Zoroastrianism, instead dedicating his life to their extinguishing. This fracturing of the religious identity of the realm would not go unpunished though, as at first, the Shahanshah attempts to negotiate with the heretics. Maybe they could discuss what it is they'd need to return to the faith, but the devout Behafarides would have none of it. They pointed to Qaboos as their leader for his influence and power. This finger-pointing would result in Shahanshah Esfandiar treating Qaboos as the center of Behafaridi power. This would lead to a formal letter of revocation arriving on Qaboos' desk about a year later, after negotiations with the heretics broke down properly. The time for war is now, and Qaboos must fight or lose everything he's worked for. How can he possibly defeat the Shahanshah, though? As if the outbreak of a war for which Qaboos was not prepared wasn't bad enough, his son Istvandad also caught leprosy just after. Great, not only is his present in danger, so too is his future now. Regardless, the present comes first, and so, at the outbreak of the war, Cobus sent his armies to ravage Poland, which he had previously conquered. It's unlikely he can actually win the war, but the hope is to try and get some kind of truce or peace quickly by doing more damage than what the Shahanshah is willing to suffer. While no lords joined him in his struggle, there was broad disapproval for the tyranny of the emperor in this matter, which in some years might foment into proper rebellion. After occupying a few counties in Poland, the imperial Persian armies arrived, and they were truly terrifying in strength. Cobus took a battle to his advantage in Viellon, which looked to be going his way, and which he did indeed win, but at an immense cost. Where this was just a small subsection of the Persian army, it took all of the power of the Bohemian forces to win a minor victory. A second battle, this time in Opole, would not prove so fortunate, as the rebellious governor's army was spectacularly defeated, and the war looked dire because of it. He went in for a counterattack in the same location after his men recovered, and Cobus was able to win the counterattack, but each loss to the emperor was far more crushing than anything he could inflict on this behemoth of an empire. His best bet was to try and pray for the death of the emperor and some kind of great civil war to break out from it, but instead, Cobus found himself winning small victories against cursory armies until the main Persian army arrived near Vienna to confront him. Despite the great positioning and planning on Cobus' part, the overwhelming Persian numbers resulted in a catastrophic defeat which forced Cobus to surrender. He was taken in chains, but then, inspiration struck. A century ago, another Persian emperor had been captured and put into chains by his enemies. Zia, the man that created this empire, was put in chains by the Pope, but rather than accept defeat, he snapped the chains to pieces with pure strength and escaped back to his home. The symbol that came out of that would define the very nature of the empire later, and although some say that story is just legend, legend is everything. Cobus flexed his muscles and roared, trying to rip the very iron from his manacles. The guards could have stopped him, but they wanted to see if this nearly 60-year-old man could pull it off. It turns out he could. Out of pure respect, and in recognition of the legendary callback to his ancestor, the guards had to let Cobus go, as he walked back to Bohemia, broken shackles on his wrists. He then sent in a formal demand to Esfandiar, outlining his illegitimacy and tyranny and demanding his removal from the throne. The court had Cobus back, and soon Esfandiar was surrounded on all sides by traitors and hawks, looking to put up an emperor of legend. Cobus never took off the manacles, no matter how uncomfortable they were, simply because of the power that their symbolism gave him. Esfandiar refused the demands, but was forced to accept that he could not imprison the rebellious Cobus. Instead, he would have to be removed from power by force, so that Cobus could take control. The rebellious nobles plotted together to organize a coup and to depose the tyrannical Shahanshah. Of special importance to this plan was the Bahafaridi heretics, who were all too happy to aid in the placement of one of their own on the throne. They're just a means to an end for Cobus, though. After a few years of plotting, it almost seemed like the Cold War between the Emperor and the legend was dying down, but Esfandiar had found out about several of the conspirators in this plot and knew what Cobus was up to. He just didn't have the influence to stop it, though. And so, on the 14th of September, in the year 1097, Esfandiar was confronted in his throne room and put into a dungeon next to the long rotted remains of Archimbald the Carolingian, who Hormazd I had thrown in prison almost 200 years ago. He shall be forgotten, just as the bones of the old king were. In his place rose the new Shahanshah, Cobus. What a beautiful empire it is, now that it's in the hands of the right man. Cobus, the heresiarch, lord of the Slavic frontier and ender of the Great Stagnation, has come. He has only one mandate to secure his eternal legacy: to extinguish the flames for good. It's not that Cobus particularly cares about the divinity of the royal flames of Iran, but it's more that he was put on this throne to do exactly that, and if he can pull it off, his legend might surpass that of even the legendary Zia. Of course, the flames would have to wait, because right now barbarians across the realm are using the chaos of a new empire to invade and pillage what they believe is a weakened realm. Little do they know, it has only gained power in this era of revolution. Even internally, the Mazda faithful have risen up, understanding the potential disaster of their great fires being extinguished for nothing more than one man's ambitions. They all would be defeated, and the Ajaccio family would have their entire lineage stripped of their titles, to be replaced by lords that would prove loyal. In the year 1100, the wars finally ceased, and the time to extinguish the fires came. First were the fires in the Alps, which were easily located and put out. Then were the smaller fires in Spoleto, Sicily, Bavaria, and Bohemia. Most of the fires were atop mountains, proudly displayed to show reverence for Ahura Mazda. When every great fire of New Persia was unlit and left to ash, the Bahafaridis celebrated their savior, Cobus, but some among them grumbled. The real fires are still back in Iran. The greatest royal fires may yet burn in the Great Zagros, which was, by this point, a prophesized holy land in a way to these Western Iranians. Although I haven't commented on it much, it's important to note that over the course of 2 centuries, these Gharbi Iranians have not forgotten that they are indeed refugees. The Zagros mountain range is one which new arrivals tell great tales of, and each new arrival describes it as taller and greater and more beautiful than the last. Apparently, some Mazda-Yazna faithful have kept secret fires going on in the holy sites of Urmia and in remote hills from Daylam. Those fires, say the most zealous Bahafiridis, are the ones which must be put out to put an end to the fire-worshipping madness of the old ways. Well, if it must be done, then it shall be done. Qaboos, well into his 60s, arranged for a war party to travel back to Iran, which was an exciting proposition for all involved. Legendary old Iran would be almost like a nice vacation for the soldiers and priests. The plan is to let the various Muslim realms in the Levant know that these armies were coming to eradicate fire worshippers and that there was no intent of war or animosity. The Muslim Arabs and Persians acquiesced, knowing that refusal would mean war. The Temple of Urmia was the first to fall and have its fire extinguished forever. The tears of the Zoroastrian priests guarding the temple did nothing but provide more water to quench the flames, and once the flame was doused, the temple itself was ransacked and the priests left in the rubble. Next was the great temple of Mazandaran, which was, according to great myth and legend, the very land that Hormazd I began his odyssey from. A beautiful place, but one tainted by impure flames which insulted the spirit of Ahura Mazda. The temple was looted, and 1 brick was given to each soldier in the war party in memory of their participation in this campaign. Reports of the last great fire that burned in exaltation of Ahriman showed that Yazd had an ancient secret community tending to a tiny ember, which was all they could get away with in their Muslim-dominated realm. Yazd was easily captured, but looking to make a great spectacle out of this last ember, Qaboos ordered his men not to extinguish it yet, but instead to preserve it and bring it back to Milan. The army understood and was excited for the great show, so they obliged, even though the priesthood grumbled at the delay of their ultimate goal. Upon returning home, Qaboos learned that yet more barbarians were invading his frontiers, and so he bid his men continue the flames' life just a bit longer while he fights off the barbarians. And then, as he stepped out of the room, he collapsed on the floor to a sudden heart attack, but didn't immediately pass away. Clutching at his chest, Qaboos knew exactly what was coming, and he grabbed the closest soldier, declaring that his heir was to be someone. He tried to say a name but couldn't get it out before entering a permanent coma and ultimately passing away. Nonetheless, this soldier thought he might have heard a name. It sounded like Miriam, which was Qaboos' firstborn daughter's name. A curious choice to put a daughter in charge, but the soldier, hoping not to disappoint his Shahanshah, said that it was the will of Qaboos that Miriam be made Baneb Shinan Baneb Shin of New Persia. She immediately ended whatever war was going on and extinguished legendary Ember of Yazd in her father's name. His corpse was still fresh enough to attend the ceremony in full imperial garb, after which Miriam began her rule. This end of the Iranian flame would become a moment of cultural genesis, as the people now known as the Fire Eaters would come out of the Bahafiridi heresy. They're composed of those who accompanied Qaboos in his rebellion and his war party, as well as those that were influenced and swayed by the new heresy in this aftermath of its great success. The Fire Eaters are essentially the coastal elites of the empire, but the story of this great empire has more or less come to an end now. How Miriam will run the empire is up to her, but it's unlikely anyone will question her or her lineage with its illustrious history in bringing greatness to the Bahafiridi faithful. I would say that her ancestors would smile upon her, but if we're being real here, Hormazd I, who set out to find new mountains where the flames of Ahura Mazda could prosper, would likely fall to his knees in depression seeing this outcome. All that he built, while magnificent in secular power, is anathema to his entire struggle to find a new home for the Zoroastrians. The fight against evil has clearly ended with Ahriman the victor, and Hormazd his instrument. Perhaps one day a new fire will be lit again, but until that day, the Yasaman family of the Hafizid dynasty will rule New Persia with the end of fire backing their claim. Qaboos was buried next to his ancestor Zia, both of whom were put to rest with their shackles still on. Any future emperor looking to topple this new order will have to live up to the legendary status of figures whose achievements may never be replicated. The future of this cursed world is certainly one which will be interesting, but where exactly it'll go is too hard to predict. Will the empire stay together? Will it fracture? How will it fracture? Will there ever be a rekindling of the royal fires? It's up to your imagination, I suppose. Thank you for your time.